Few people were neutral about Enoch Powell. To many, he was a political hero. To many others, a hate figure. He was a man who rarely observed the conventional rules of politics.
I never played the game of snakes and ladders. I never was interested in playing that game. So I was the odd man out, like a man on a playing field who isn't playing the game.
Are you still ambitious?
I was born ambitious. I suppose I shall die ambitious. I could no more change it than the colour of my eyes.
Will you answer just yes or no to the
Not necessarily. No, because there are many questions to which the answer yes and no is alike false.
Let's say I've got a gun and I'm saying you can only answer yes or no. You're not even prepared to play a little game with me.
I'll try, but without any guarantee of compliance.
Do you have ambitions to be the Prime Minister of this country?
Oh, well, if you needn't have made all that fuss about that. Yes, of course.
Enoch was the best parliamentarian I ever knew. Everything in Enoch's speeches had to be worked out in reason from first principles.
Enoch Powell was the most controversial of Tory politicians before Margaret Thatcher. His devotees claimed he was a man of unwavering principle. His detractors, that he represented the respectable face of gutter politics. The former Wolverhampton MP himself says that the thread which runs through his life is his belief in the nation.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. Well, I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? My answer is that I do not have the right not to do so.
The flag of racialism, which has been hoisted in Wolverhampton, is beginning to look like the one that fluttered 25 years ago over Dachau and Belsen.
Powell became the target for demonstrators after his rivers of blood speech in Birmingham. But attitudes towards him traversed normal party lines. Although a high Tory, he won the plaudits of many traditional Labour voters, like the London dockers.
I think the dockers sang, Enoch here, Enoch there, we want Enoch everywhere. That could serve as the text for that cartoon. Even the cat is Enoch.
Now that's a dog, isn't it? There's a dog, it's on the knee.
The little dog is Enoch.
And there's a baby one.
And the baby is a baby Enoch. And it's Enoch leaning out of the windows and talking to his neighbour.
The right and the left. And riding a bicycle, which you've always had trouble with.
Powell and his wife keep a wall of cartoons of his political career at their home in London. His favourite is the one drawn after his Rivers of Blood speech, featuring a street of identikit Enochs. It could mean a country all peopled by Enoch Powells, all white with moustaches.
It could mean that, but it doesn't. I think it was a contemporary reference to that song, Enoch here, Enoch there, we want Enoch everywhere.
What do you think of having this one form of memento on a wall of your political life?
I'm slightly embarrassed about it.
No, Enoch, you can't be.
Yes.
No, you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be.
Why not?
Because it's all part of your life and it's fun. These are amusing. I think they're fun.
They're amusing.
Yes, they are amusing.
But to be amused by one's own former doings is self.
Well, you won't write your own life history, so it's jolly nice to have bits of it picked up.
Yes, all right.
I think so.
If it pleases you, that's
good
enough.
It does please me. No, thank you. It does jolly well please me. I like it.
Pamela Powell remains her husband's most loyal supporter. She says she's come to expect having their lives turned upside down every few years. For Powell has spent a lifetime provoking controversy. He'd been born in a thunderstorm in Birmingham in 1912. His parents were both school teachers. The young John Enoch Powell was so precocious that he was nicknamed the Professor.
There were stuffed birds which my grandfather had shot, displayed in the home where I grew up. And I used to stand on a chair and tell visitors what their names were and give a brief description of each bird. It was on that occasion that I was called the Professor.
How old were you then?
3.
3?
3.
He won a scholarship to King Edward's Grammar School, Birmingham, where he was known as Scowly Powley. He established himself as brilliant at Greek and Latin. A contemporary at school was Christopher Evans.
He was fiendishly clever, and we were all rather frightened of him, as I think were some of his masters, actually. He was so good, and rather knew it, I think. And my memory of him is of a rather pale, slightly stooping boy with head thrust forward, rather intense look and serious look in his face. He was a loner, complete loner.
I wasn't different from other children. I was just as naughty. I was just as wicked and malevolent.
Really?
Yes.
What sort of things did you
I
do?
hesitate to remember the depredations which I helped to commit upon the rolling stock of the Midland Railway Company as we travelled to and from King Edward's, Birmingham.
What sort of thing did you do?
Well, I have been known to unscrew the luggage rack in the compartment so that this could be thrown out during the tunnels.
So you were an early sort of soccer hooligan?
I was an early delinquent.
Powell went as a classic scholar to Trinity College, Cambridge, the finishing school for future Soviet spies and Tory cabinet ministers. But he was too busy for extramural activities.
As an undergraduate, I got up at 5. I knew nothing else to do but to work. I didn't keep a fire in my room. I worked in an overcoat with my feet in a blanket. Because I thought that more conducive to mental effort. Whether it is so or not, I don't know, but I did. I had no social life as an undergraduate.
What about as far as women were concerned?
They didn't exist.
But you must have seen women at Cambridge?
Yes, I noticed them.
And what did you think of them?
I wondered what they were doing there.
But surely...
Because I didn't think they would approach advanced learning in the same mood or manner as a man would.
Why did you think that?
Because the analytical faculty is underdeveloped in women.
Although he claims he knew no women there, at Cambridge Powell wrote his first book of poems, some of them highly erotic, which revealed the intensity of feelings beneath the ascetic facade. I did not speak, but when I saw you turn and cross your right leg on your left and fold your hands across your knee, I felt a flow of white-hot lava seething up the old volcano shaft. That self-same attitude, though not of yours, it was which long ago fired me, an innocent, unknowing boy, and led me on to sin and on to learn and onwards to the very fount of woe.
Oh, that's perfect love poem, isn't it?
That's what it seems to me, but who was it written to?
It wasn't written to anybody. It was written as an exercise.
What, a work of the imagination?
A work of the imagination.
When he was 25, Powell flew to Australia. He'd become Professor of Greek at Sydney University. There, his feelings of British nationalism grew as he became convinced that war was inevitable. His poems show he welcomed the prospect of dying fighting for his country, although he believed the Nazis would win the war.
I felt I could hear the German divisions marching across Europe, and I could hear this drumming coming through the earth and just coming up again in Australia where no one else could hear.
Powell volunteered when war began and says he spent the happiest time of his life as a private soldier in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. But he had high military ambitions and was soon to rise with record speed through the ranks. The army had quickly spotted Powell's intellectual and linguistic talents, and he was sent for training as an intelligence officer. A fellow cadet at Aldershot was a young fashion couturier who was to become a lifelong friend and the Queen's dress designer.
We were a motley crew And Enoch Powell was there, didn't play a great part in the sort of boisterous evenings, boozing a bit and so on, which obviously young officer cadets did. He was conspicuous by lying on his bed most of the time, reading. And it turned out when you asked him, what you're reading, he said, oh, well, I'm reading the Bible. And he said, if it sounds funny, I'll tell you that it's even funnier because it's in Greek. And he was popular, but we sort of took him as a bit of a nutcase, I suppose.
Did you get on with Hardy?
Yes, I got on well with him.
You don't seem terribly similar characters.
Similar characters don't generally like one another.
What did you find attractive about Hardy Jonas then?
If I say his gaiety, that mustn't be misunderstood.
Joie de vivre.
Right, let's say joie de vivre.
Powell was sent to work as an intelligence officer with the 8th Army in North Africa. His task was to get inside the mind of the German Army Commander General Rommel by deploying his professional skills as a textual critic. The secret signals sent by Rommel's Africa Corps were all being intercepted by the British. And though Rommel was known as the Desert Fox, Professor Powell came to understand more about the General's plans than anyone else in the British Army. After the British victory at Alamein, Powell was to become the only private soldier throughout the war to reach the rank of brigadier. He was posted to India and slept his first night on Delhi railway station.
When I woke up, I discovered I'd fallen in love with India. The smells, the sights, everything. And from that moment onwards, I dedicated myself to learning about India. The Indians and the British dreamt a dream, and they dreamt it together, and they still dream it. If an Indian and an Englishman meet today, they say, let's go over in that corner and dream our dream together. There's this link, this natural attraction between India and Britain. Inexplicable, a weird thing.
Enoch Powell's own Anglo-Indian dream was not one of equality, but of continued British rule. Not for the only time in his life, he was passionately attaching himself to a lost cause. While it was clear to the rest of the world that the Raj was fast coming to an end, Brigadier Powell now set himself a forlorn career ambition.
The greatest position that a man could occupy in the service of the British Crown was as Viceroy of India. And it was the calculation that preferment in India was earned by preferment in British politics that took me into British politics when I returned home on demobilisation.
You mean that...
It was India that took me into politics in England.
In the hope that you might yourself become Viceroy of India?
Or Governor of one of the 3 provinces.
Powell returned to work in the Conservative Research Department and was adopted to fight Wolverhampton South West only after applying unsuccessfully to 19 other constituencies. In the 1950 general election, he won the seat and once again found himself hopelessly smitten.
I fell head over heels under the spell of the House of Commons. I said, this is wonderful, this is what I want. The only thing worth having is to be a member of this place and to remain a member of this place. The vision of this place, whose decisions and words are hung upon by a nation. It was the incarnation of a nation to me.
Having taught himself to ride in early middle age, Powell now took up fox hunting. And it was in pursuit of the uneatable that he at last found a tangible human being, rather than an institution or an abstraction, to be the recipient of his passions.
Well, I fell in love with someone while I was hunting.
And what happened there?
That failed.
Why?
I was not satisfactory.
You mean you wanted to marry her and she turned you down?
That's right.
His love was Barbara Manor Kennedy, a colonel's daughter from the Shropshire county set. She was 23, he was 37, and she was the first woman he'd ever courted. Powell dedicated a book of poems to his love, identifying her only as B. One of them told of how they parted. I dreamt that on a mountain crest, as in the sheep-cropped grass we lay.
You ceased, the wind that through the sward with steady breathing passion swept, from flower and grass and heather splint, amen to that strange sacrament. And silent as it seemed we wept. You mustn't put me in a situation in which I'm so overcome by emotion, old emotion, but resummoned by the poetry written under the spell of that emotion.
And this was the first time that you'd fallen in love, was it?
It was.
And first love is often the most
Intense,
passionate of all. Yeah.
Intense, yes. And mysterious.
Have you ever seen her since?
No. Not since she was married.
What then happened as far as your love life was concerned?
Well, then I took up with the lady who did marry me and lived happily ever after, I believe one adds.
We knew each other quite well as boss and secretary. I found him very attractive. His eyes were very blue, and he was great fun.
Pamela Wilson, herself a colonel's daughter, vividly recalls how the 40-year-old Brigadier Powell proposed.
We had a dinner at a Chinese restaurant, and I knew he was going to ask me, and 3 days later he did ask me. And what he actually said, when he was on his bended knee, no less, he actually said to me, I can't promise you anything except a life of poverty, grinding poverty, and a life totally on the back benches, which to me, as I knew politics, I knew exactly what that meant.
Her mother had told Pamela Wilson that being married to Enoch Powell would be like going to university every day for the rest of her life. She relished the prospect, but was unprepared for the absent-mindedness of her professor on their return from honeymoon.
They don't know the story of what happened when we first got married, how hopeless you are at remembering women's faces.
That's right.
I married him, we married, we had a 3-week honeymoon, and then within 4 weeks, wasn't it?
You came to meet me in the central lobby and watched me going
I
round
watched him go all the way
looking
round,
for her.
wondering which one he'd married and been on a honeymoon with.
Although he'd promised his wife a life of grinding backbench poverty, Powell's political star was soon rising. The father of 2 daughters presented an ideal family man image. Powell was appointed a Treasury Minister and began to be talked of as a future Tory leader. But he resigned from Macmillan's government in protest against increased public spending. He was a prototype monetarist before Mrs. Thatcher was even an MP. In 1965, with the Tories in opposition, Powell stood for the party leadership against Ted Heath. Heath won, but Powell had left his visiting card. And unlike the Bachelor leader, Powell had duties as a father. He was determined to inculcate his daughters with his own reverence for Britain's past. Before their regular family picnics, known as Powell picnics, he would take them on lecture tours of medieval churches.
It's 12th century up to the short of the top story, and this perpendicular window is late 14th, early 15th century. Been put in, there was probably a narrow light originally there.
It wasn't all tours round old churches. Enoch Powell would regularly provide a bizarre form of entertainment for his daughters.
He doesn't really like going into the water or swimming or anything else like that, and he, above all, hates his hair being washed. And when the children were small, they used to queue up outside the door to hear his screams, because he made such a performance of having his hair washed by me that he would make screams, and they would come up from their rooms and listening to father screaming while his hair was being washed.
I would be on the ground floor, and the noise, the objections reverberated down the pipes that ran down the outside of the house as he was being given his weekly hair wash. He does not like water on his head.
By 1968, Enoch Powell had become a recognisable political figure. But a colleague detected worrying symptoms. Poor Enoch, he remarked, driven mad by the remorselessness of his own logic. Powell was now developing an ideology markedly to the right of Ted Heath's, above all on the taboo subject of race. Powell was alarmed at what he saw as the dangers of coloured immigration to the British nation. His views seemed to contrast sharply with his professed love for India.
India is India, and England is England. And an Englishman can have a love for India without wishing to see India on the streets of Birmingham.
The issue of race was to bring Powell into confrontation with Heath. Powell decided to quote directly from the experiences with immigrants of his white constituents. Only parts of that polemical speech were filmed, but Powell has kept his original text. He began by attacking the Labour government's bill that outlawed racial discrimination.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
Powell quoted a letter he said he'd received about an elderly widow living in Wolverhampton, the only white resident left in her street. He quoted from the letter, "She's becoming afraid to go out. Windows are broken. She finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. When she goes to the shop, she's followed by children, charming, wide-grinning piccaninnies. They cannot speak English, but one word they know, racialist, they chant."
Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad. Literally mad as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
Powell ended the speech with a quote from Virgil translated from Latin. "As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." It was that line, not filmed at the time, which gave the speech its Rivers of Blood title. As the storm broke in the press, the Times condemned it as an evil speech, and there were growing demands for Ted Heath to sack Powell from the shadow cabinet.
I remember Ted ringing me up on Sunday morning, because it was all over the Sunday papers, saying Enoch must go. And I said, look, I would just wait and just read the whole speech and just think about it for a few days. No, he must go. Everyone says he must go. And I gathered later there would have been resignations from shadow cabinet if Enoch hadn't gone. I thought it was a conclusion jumped to far too rapidly if you looked at the logic and reason in his speech.
I dismissed Mr. Powell from the shadow cabinet because I believed that his speech was inflammatory and liable to damage race relations in this country. I am determined to do everything I can to prevent racial problems developing into civil strife. And this means that these questions must be treated with moderation and with toleration.
He ran away, was alarmed. He was frightened out of his wits.
By what you had said?
By the outcry. I'd said the same thing over and over again in previous speeches, but he was alarmed by the outcry and, sensing danger, ran for cover.
In fact, Powell had never made a speech so explicit before, and there was now a groundswell of support for him from seemingly unlikely quarters.
Enoch Powell! Enoch Powell! Are they do still?
The London dockers had demanded his reinstatement, and the Smithfield meat porters marched on Parliament with a petition.
There's 2,026 signatures there to say that Mr. Enoch's right. That we have the right to say who we like and who we don't like. This is not a racial problem. All we say is that we've got enough immigrants into the country and that no more should be allowed in.
Nobody had any idea of the effect that it would have. It touched the spring, a spring which vibrated in the hearts of millions of people in this country.
2,000 signatures in 2 days. Listen, Chris, 88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell. 88% Slough people.
As Powell's fans besieged his Belgravia home, his 11-year-old daughter Susan kept a diary of events.
It was all very exciting as a child. The police were there, and in my diary I refer to the letters that arrived, and we used to have our own Royal Mail van purely for Daddy, bringing sacks and sacks of letters. And on the Thursday, the 23rd of April, for example, we'd already had 23,000 letters. And the next day there were 50,000. And I remember sitting round the dining room table along with other friends, just slitting letters. They just piled up, and this was incredible.
The great majority of the letters to Powell were in his favour.
Enoch, we've never seen through these since that, God knows how long ago it was. Do you remember these things?
Yes, we read through the whole 45,000.
We read through the whole 45, or what was more than that. Don't you remember it was more than that? Then people say that it wasn't a natural thing, and here we have these letters. We all admire you for your great courage. I'm also writing to Mr. Edward Heath. I bet he got a lot. By Jove, he'd be getting a lot. I'm certain that the present setback in your political career will have been worthwhile.
The persistent theme of the letters from all over the country was that Britain was being changed in ways the writers disliked and feared, without any consultation.
Read there.
Thank God at last someone had outspoken for the whole people of England.
For the white people of England.
Who gave up their freedom to fight in 2 world wars to enable their children to live a better life. Did we go through the day and night terror of doodlebugs, incendiary bombs and bombing, so that these hordes of black locusts might come here and buy the homes we have known for years and make our lives unbearable?
Immigration! No! Repatriation! Yes!
Powell had become a hero of the National Front, as the only mainstream senior politician to voice sentiments normally confined to the back streets. But the speech aroused fear and anger among blacks and Asians. A schoolboy at the time, later himself to become an MP, recalls the day after the Rivers of Blood speech.
I was one of those wide-eyed, grinning pickaninnies that he saw fit to quote in a letter, and that was hurtful, of course. For the first time in the country of my birth, and the country of which I'm proud to say I belong, I was shouted at and spat at and abused in the streets, for the first time ever, the day after that. So, of course, I remember it.
I take it as true since he says so. I accept it as truth. But it only revealed the underlying tensions.
But can you see that the language that you quoted in your speech was itself inflammatory and could be used by people who were racialists against black people in this country?
What's wrong with racism? Racism is the basis of a nationality. It's the basis of his nationality.
He says he's black, but he's British, and he feels British. What is his nationality?
His nationality is the nationality he feels is the nation he'll fight for. Or play cricket for.
But are you saying that because he's black he can't have British nationality?
It's not impossible, it is difficult.
But when you said that racism is the basis of his nationality, what did you mean by that?
Nations are, upon the whole, united by identity with one another, the self-identification of our citizens, and that's normally due to similarities which we regard as racial similarities.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your intelligent reception and for your demonstration of the academic principle of freedom of speech.
Powell's visits to universities across the country were now regularly disrupted. He aroused stronger feelings, both pro and anti, than any other politician of his time.
Through argument and through freedom, we can give and receive reason. Thank you.
One student who never joined the protests and who sought to keep quiet about the identity of her father was Powell's daughter Jennifer.
Inside me, I used to feel quite sick when I knew that he was going to be speaking about immigration, because I just hated what I knew I would read in the papers and the headlines and what I might see on the television. It would make my stomach churn.
Powell's the one they should arrest. He's the one who's broken the law.
And I would not attack or defend his decision to use whatever language he used. That's his business. It's not my business. The reasons I wished he wouldn't do things that would give people ammunition to say these horrible things about him was because I couldn't bear people saying horrible things about my precious father.
At Tory conferences, Powell now became the darling of the party's right-wing activists. But his leader, who declined to take part in this programme, was not impressed.
Too often today, people are ready to tell us, this is not possible, that is not possible. I say, whatever the true interest of our country calls for is always possible.
Powellism reached parts of the Tory party which Ted Heath could never reach. And Powell was now staking his claim for Heath's job. In the 1970 general election, he again inflamed feelings with a series of speeches far to the right of Ted Heath.
This is Enoch Powell.
Enoch Powell has emerged, in some senses, as the real leader of the Conservative Party in this campaign. But for those who doubt this, the final proof of Powell's power is that Heath dare not attack him publicly, even when he says things that disgust decent Conservatives.
Well, Mr. Powell is officially accepted Conservative candidate. He's been chosen by his Conservative Association. And like all Conservative candidates, I want to see them elected.
Heath won the election, but ironically Powell had helped put him in. The swing to the Tories was higher in Powell's heartland of the West Midlands than anywhere else. But Heath's victory grievously disappointed Powell, who, according to friends, sat with his head in his hands for days.
There are situations in which one is foreseeably more advantaged by one's party losing than by it winning. That was one.
So you were dejected when the Conservatives won in 1970?
It sealed my exile.
Because you could see that Heath in 1970 had become Prime Minister, whereas if the Conservatives had lost in 1970, there was a chance for you becoming party leader.
Everything would become fluid again.
The cartoonist depicted Powell waiting like a British General de Gaulle in exile at Wolverhampton-les-Deux-Églises for the call to lead his nation. But Powell was no idle exile.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Yes.
He sought to get over his ideas and build up his image in every way he could.
Is your husband from home?
And you could put "with love" from under that.
Yes, I could. I could, but I shan't. I say this is marvellous television, isn't it? The desk is over there.
He accepted a string of invitations to speak on the Tory rubber chicken circuit across the country.
You are aware, are you not, that I'm opening a garden party?
Yes.
On the Saturday afternoon. Hat, dress. There's a ladies' luncheon. There's a YC wine and cheese. There's a tea club. There's a wine and beer. One hat for the wine, one for the beer. And there's a ward supper. Now, will you kindly tell me how many hats and how many suitcases that represents? Because that's what's got to go into the car.
As the Tory government ran into mounting political trouble, Powell became the Prime Minister's bête noire. He was forever deriding Heath's economic U-turns. As a preacher of Tory fundamentalism, Powell had a secret female admirer within the cabinet, both for what he had to say and for the way he would say it.
He spoke in a way with his whole body. If he wanted to emphasize a point, you would see his hands going, and his eyes were powerful. And his voice was much more powerful in those days than it is now. So this combination of impeccable and implacable reason from first principles applied to whatever was the debate in hand.
I'm always nervous before a big speech. You can't make a big speech unless you are nervous. Nerves is part of the act.
Did you seek to build up a tension in yourself? I think Someone told me that you would like to make a speech on a full bladder.
Well, you shouldn't be at ease. You shouldn't be relaxed. And if you need to clear your bladder in order to relax, you should refrain if possible. You should be tense.
You don't tax a loss. You only tax a profit. You raise more, the more profit there is to tax. We all live on the profits of British industry. It's a truism. And those people have been gravely misled who imagine that there's one set of people, remote people, somewhere over there, who live on profits, but the rest of us don't. We all do. We are all in this together. And the future of all of us is bound up with the future of free British industry.
It was Europe that was to cause the final break between Heath and Powell. Ted Heath's application for Britain to join the common market aroused Powell's nationalistic feelings, even though, ironically, Powell had himself once been a pro-marketeer like Heath.
Je suis convaincu que nous vivons un moment historique comparable à celui d'il y a 20 ans.
As the anti-marketeers marched on number 10, Powell prophesied that our entry into Europe would never happen and the bill to take us in would be defeated.
I would have done anything to prevent the Conservative Party from passing that bill. I did all I could. I voted in the lobby against it 106 times.
Did you not feel any loyalty to the Conservative government?
My first loyalty is to the people of this country. And I thought they were being deprived behind their backs of something which I believed they valued and still believe they do, their self-government through Parliament.
In February 1974, Powell suddenly announced he would not be standing in the general election, and he compounded the shock by calling on all anti-marketeers to vote Labour because the party was proposing a referendum on our membership. And at a packed anti-market meeting on the eve of the general election, Powell denied he was betraying the Tory party. He told his audience he didn't need any lessons in political consistency from Ted Heath.
Now, there are a lot of people about whom it behoves to be very cautious in accusing their political opponents of past or prospective U-turns. So the elector, let us admit, Judas was paid. Judas was paid. I am making a sacrifice.
I was making a sacrifice. I was leaving the Conservative Party. I had left it because, having opposed the European Community Bill, I did not see how I could invite the electors of Wolverhampton to return me to Parliament as a Conservative.
Heath lost the election by the narrowest of margins. And once again it seemed that Powell's intervention had had a decisive effect, as the anti-Tory swing was more marked in the West Midlands than anywhere else in the country.
Having been up late the previous night, I tiptoed down and saw the newspaper slanting through the letterbox. Heath's gamble fails. I pulled it through and it fell open. And I retired to the bathroom and sang the Te Deum. It seemed as if my work was accomplished. I had had my revenge on the man who had destroyed the self-government of the United Kingdom.
So you had helped bring him to power, and now you helped bring him down?
I put him in and I took him out. It's a cruder way of putting it.
By the end of 1974, Powell was again an MP. The Wolverhampton Wanderer had become an Ulster Unionist with his own idiosyncratic policy. He proposed that Ulster lose its separate status and be completely integrated with Britain. Once again, Powell seemed happier attaching himself to an apparently lost cause. Yet within 5 years, a new Prime Minister was actually putting Powell's economic theories into practice. Mrs. Thatcher was said to carry in her handbag extracts from his speeches. But Powell could summon up little public enthusiasm for the Thatcher brand of monetarism. Did you approve of what she was doing economically?
It was in concord with my ideas.
You seem to be sort of rather grudging about what Mrs. Thatcher did as Prime Minister economically.
I was never
Powell
quite
doesn't.
sure that she understood the doctrine. She was applying it, but did she understand it? That was the question.
Would you say economically that you are a Powellite?
I would say economically we both hold the same views, and I originally got them from Enoch, but also, of course, Keith Joseph took them up, and we developed them very much in the Centre of Policy Studies, and they are now the orthodox views. And I hope that I was just a little bit of a help in putting them into practice and seeing what they could do for the British people.
Enoch Powell celebrated his 83rd birthday at a friend's house earlier this year with his family and his grandchildren.
The other one. You're going to learn your letters now. Oh, that's an O. O. When your mouth is round, then you say O.
I can't say O. I can't say that.
O.
The Powells have now been married for over 40 years.
That's an A. A for apple. Go and tell Grandpa that.
The poems he once used to write to an imaginary woman are now written to Pamela Powell.
A good beginning.
Alpha.
Alpha. I do write poetry for my wife, but I only write it once a year on our anniversary. I started at our first anniversary by presenting her with 1 rose and 1 poem. At the second with 2 roses and 2 poems.
We never could at first have thought what all the years between have brought, nor seen ourselves with blushing posies composed of 37 roses, and goodness knows what still remains of such uncovenanted gains. No cause then to begrudge the years where always something new appears, or with the passing time deplore the pleasures that we had before. The only thing that does get worse, it seems, is quality of verse. Nice little twist, isn't it, at the end of that?
I say jocularly, it is her pension. I say you can publish these when I am dead. I don't know whether this is advice that she will follow. I shall not be there to see, or to receive the royalties.
The marketplace romantic has carefully planned the arrangements for his own funeral. After a service in the chapel of his regiment, he'll be buried in full-dress brigadier's uniform.
Look at those flags, Enoch. Aren't they marvellous? Really wonderful.
Powell's British nationalism has led him to attach himself to many a lost cause and to utter many a prophecy of doom. But he says he has no regrets, least of all for being the one senior politician prepared to play the racial card. He once famously remarked that all political careers end in failure.
I end in political failure. Yes. Mine has ended in failure from one point of view. Without a seat, without office, without apparent achievement. But I've achieved a good deal, and I hear my voice coming through in what is said, and I see myself being proved right. What I had to say about immigration, what I had to say about the nation, what I had to say about Europe was heard and is still echoing.
Enoch Powell is now working on a new interpretation of the Greek Bible. As a classical scholar, he can reflect on the supreme irony in his own life, that the rivers of blood speech transformed him into a national figure, yet at the same time ensured he would never be given charge of the nation's destiny.
But I spend more time thinking than reading, which is as it should be.